Okay, so welcome to another Crypto Village talk. I'm Matt Singleton, this is Trey, and we'll be talking about PKI, public key infrastructure, revocation, the frailty of PKI, so specifically about some weaknesses in revocation. We're not here to drop O days, but sort of to talk about the state of the industry and some things that are kind of challenging for the encryption that we pretty much use every day on the web with applications. Probably the most commonly used kinds of encryption there are. Okay, so revocation began as something that you did directly to distrust certificates. When you've set up PKI, you have it working, you're going to find certificates that get compromised, that have problems, that get lost, stolen, whatever, and you have to make them distrusted. So this is what revocation is meant for. And when that started scaling, it's evolved over the last 20 years. After direct manual certificate revoking, which you do directly on your own device, or on a per specific device, non-network related manner, the idea of bringing different kinds of devices together for certificate revocation. So CRLs are a way of taking a lot of certificates and bundling up in a file that can be dispersed. That evolved again because it didn't scale. If you have to have a large file with every certificate that's being revoked, that grows and grows and grows, it gets out of control. So OCSP is the next evolution of that, and OCSP is a protocol that, think of it like a database query. You're saying, is this certificate good? And it'll come back and tell you within a time span, yes, it's good, or no, it's not. So you don't retrieve all of them, you only get the stuff that you need. Down the road, so we'll talk about the weaknesses of these things, and then down the road what the alternatives are. Short-lived certificates, so constraining the timelines to do the same, try to accomplish the same goal, and an effort by Google called certificate transparency. So RFC 5280 is where these things are defined. In theory, there's two different states for revocation, which is revoked and held. But the reality is it's just the most common one is revoked. So a little bit of background here. When certificate authorities provide certificates that are signed, they do so in kind of three general assurance levels. That's known as, in the industry, the CA industry, as DV, OV, and EV. The reason this is related to revocation is that they have different requirements. So you have a higher level of assurance with the extended validation because the certificate authorities will go to much greater depth when they're vetting the entity that the certificate's for. And one of the things that go along with that you get is that OCSP is a requirement. So that most current kind of revocation check is made available. So this means that when you buy that $400 certificate from your CA, they're effectively obligated during that 2-year timeline to provide an OCSP server and response that will address that. That way they're not compromising their intermediate, and again, it's one of those things that's required. So when you hit the green bar in your mobile OS and you see the green lock and all that, that's typically involving OCSP at this point in time, and CRL is still built into these devices, but less and less commonly used. It's kind of grandfathered in. The CRLs are still there, just not as commonly used. So there are other assurance levels. I won't go into details other than to say CAs will do their own extra magic sauce for other levels. So for explicitly revoking trust, the methods vary by operating system. Mac OS X uses the keychain as a GUI and then the security as the command line tool. It's one from my work that I'm the most familiar with. And that those settings for revocation are found ultimately in the system trust settings plist. Windows, I've got the TechNet article there to say also has a GUI, and you can dig in, again, exercise left to the reader. You can go and take specific certificates and mark them as untrusted. For Linux, again, it's going to depend upon whether you're using LibreSSL or OpenSSL or whatever your stack is. I've got the command here for how Mozilla handles certificate revocation. An example being a recently compromised certificate, or at least a certificate from Bluecoat that was not being handled according to the agreements that Symantec and Blue Coat had. So it's one that you'd want to have pervasively across the internet, no longer trusted or used. So to take another further example, to dig a little bit further on Mac OS X, the security dump keychain will give you all of the system root certificates. They're about 190 or 180. Apple updates these on a quarterly basis or semi-annual basis, and that's again the root certificates. Removing a root is not the same as revocation. So revocation happens between the intermediates and the leaves. That's how the revocation gets managed. But again, to manually trust or distrust for the whole chain, you could take a root certificate and do a security add trusted cert deny, and then that certificate will then no longer, and all of the things that are chain up to it will no longer be trusted. So with this command, you could, for example, remove trust to certificates from Turkey or China, things like that. So it's useful, but they're being only 180 in the OS. If you drop the VeriSign certificate, maybe you'd lose like a third of all of your connections. So you have to do this kind of carefully. I don't think Apple wants to have this being commonly like recommended. But if you do really need to lock down a machine, it's comforting to know that this is there. Okay. So again, that's at the level of the root. So what we'll do for the rest of this talk is step through certificate revocation lists, CRLs, the old way of doing it, and then OCSP, the protocol that's more common in standard currently. So CRLs are encoded as a dir or a PEM file, and effectively it's just a file that's being hosted. Within the X509 header of a certificate, there'll be an EKU, an extended key usage, that basically designates where the CRL will be for that certificate. So when you're doing the chain evaluation, it knows where to check. So you would have a domain set up and a domain name associated with that when the certificate is used in a circumstance in which revocation has to be checked, which can also be a requirement in the X509 header, it will go out and make that connection and do that check. So OpenSSL CRL, there's a command, I don't see it on this slide, but anyway, there's a command in OpenSSL to create the file that could be hosted that way. And then I just want to note in passing, in addition to the X509 headers, the certificate policy statements from the CA will also have these and describe how they're operating and how they're handling revocation. Next. So here's how to make Apache serve CRLs. There's a Apache config directory SSL CA revocation path or SSL CA revocation file, and you point that to the file where you're hosting these. And then when the request gets made, typically over HTTP or HTTPS, then that file gets received, and the stack that's evaluating the chain will see all those things to revoke and prevent them from being evaluated as trusted. So basically, again, a CRL is just this bag of certificates that are untrusted that grows over time. Also, OpenVPN has a directive that's related. So next slide. Other places you can find these things. Here are a couple little Google strings that can help you just find scads and scads of certificate revocation lists that are hosted out there. The certificate authorities largely host these, and large organizations that are doing PKI will also keep these collections of untrusted certificates. Once it's untrusted, you kind of can't. It kind of sticks around forever. These things, the contents of those, you never want to say, "Well, we've been untrusting all this time, but we'll take it out." I mean, you have to kind of keep maintaining these lists, and they grow, which is why OCSP is a more attractive option. I also want to point out that the policies for checking CRLs and handling revocation sometimes are at the operating system level, and sometimes they're at the application level. So it takes a little bit of kind of thought to figure out when you're using an app, is it your OS making the check or is it the app making a check? And a good sort of example here is Firefox handles it all within its own app. So it'll have the entire stack in Mozilla Firefox by itself. Mozilla has a nice feature that pushes CRLs in a compressed form out on a 3-week basis. So Firefox is doing some really cool stuff. There's a format for compressed CRLs there I've shown, and then the patch where Mozilla has done that. Next slide. The reason that Mozilla and Firefox are doing this is that they're kind of keeping up with Google's Certificate Transparency Initiative, where you have large sets of certificates that are not trusted, and yet not necessarily the ability to scale with a lot of requests, because as you make a request, it's more overhead every time you do an SSL request. So it's kind of hard to find, but if you dig for it, or if you watch your traffic for a 3 or 4 week period on Firefox, you'll see it make a request out to this blocklist.addons.mozilla.org to pull down that set. And then again, some links to Mozilla policies about where the CAs can report revoked certificates. But by and large, that's not really in the certificate authority's interest to do a lot of this reporting to the public. It's more headache. It's things that don't work instead of things that do. So they're not terribly incentivized economically to keep the CAs, or to keep the contents of their revoked set made public. So it would be good for us to keep the CAs on track and make sure that they're actually doing their job and handling revocation correctly. Okay, so on to OCSP. Again, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. It's encoded in ASN1 with all the joys and tribulations that brings with it. So ASN1 is abstract syntax notation. It's a very compressed encoding format. It's, as a protocol, you basically are making an outbound request for a given certificate or a given chain to see if it's valid or not. Again, run with very high availability requirements and very low ping times for the big CAs. On the client side, the requests are good for a given span of time, and there's the span of time in which the CA can provide the response for, which might be, you're good for the next year or something, and then there's the actual caching of that check by the OS or the application. So there's a lot of different sort of time slices to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting and working through this. Like I said, there's the official, here's what the server, OCSP server, will tell you, and then there's what the actual clients are doing with it. Those are very often very different timelines. So you'd want your browser or your device to check on a fairly periodic basis, even though maybe the certificate's good for a year or 2 years, which is typical for EV. The next day, maybe that was revoked. So how do you know it's still good, right? So there's this kind of set of different timelines about whether when under what period of time the certificate is good. All right, next slide.
Okay. Right now, we're just going to walk you through working through a basic example of going through an OCSP query. And these are actually pretty straightforward. This is a OpenSSL command. The command's at the top, the first bit of the output. These are kind of long outputs. But basically what it's going to do is start going to get the certificate. The next thing you would want to do is save it as a file, which is that last little redirect I've got at the end. And then literally it's this one OpenSSL x509 command, and this is all you've got to do to parse it, and you'll get this URL. And this is basically telling you the OCSP URI. And that's basically all you have to do to verify where it is. For the next example, we're looking at how you actually do the query if you've got a chain. And this first step is the same. We're just going to save the certificate to a file so that we've got it. But then this part we're going to do is grab the certificate chain. And this is going to vary in length depending on how the certificate's signed, number of intermediaries, also sometimes where you're at, if you've got an intermediary or whatever listening on your network or through your country or whatnot. But this is going to pull all that data, and you can start seeing inside of it all the different issuers of who all's in the certificate chain for that. The next thing is this is just a simple command. We're going to save the chain to a file. And then this is inside of that chain file. And if you look at this right here, you see the I. The I is the issuer. That's the first thing that you're actually going to look for, because you're going to actually want to be verifying who's issuing the certificate for this particular website. So this is the thing that you're going to have to pull out of that. And then this is where you're actually going to verify the certificate with the issuer. And you can see what we did is we pulled the chain as the issuer. We did this for DEF CON, and then we actually are going straight to the certificate provider for the DEF CON OCSP URL, and that's going to be a site. They're usually something like this, ocsp.sslprovidersname.com. The important thing is not to be fooled by this successful response, but make sure that the cert status is actually good. So this can be a little misleading. You want to make sure that you're actually getting the cert directly certified from the issuer.
Okay. So, and maybe we'll just stop for a second. Any questions so far? Yes. So that those responses are signed. So they're signed by the issuing CA.
There's an issue that we're going to talk about in a couple of slides that does have to do with one part of your question.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about the OCSP staple, OCSP mod staple messages, as well as the differences to we should probably keep it in?
We're on the way. Yes. Okay. Yes. Can you repeat the question?
So it is given the next update time given the response. Should the client, is there a use in client waiting the server before the next update?
So let me repeat the question to make sure I get it. So you're saying with this, the timeline for the next update, is there a reason for the client to, is it a requirement for the client to go and make another request after that expires? Mm-hmm.
Basically, like if it's cached, it doesn't have to check again. Is that what you're asking? So the he's asking if the OCSP query is cached.
So the question is, are the OCSP queries cached? Yes, the answer is yes. And the policy for that can depend upon the requesting stack. So most browsers and operating systems will have a cache for the OCSP queries for that reason, and they'll all have timelines for when that's done. So when it does the evaluation, there's a time check every time. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, next question. Okay, so just some words about revocation on iOS. These aren't typically things that you can access unless you've got a jailbroken device. The CRL is located in VAR-DB. The OCSP daemon is there. These were used in previous jailbreaks, and so they've been attacked. It's part of the infrastructure that gets attacked. The revocation cache is in a SQLite file, and again, you can't do this on your iPhone unless you jailbreak it and directly work with these files. But when you get that SQLite file, you can actually take a look at the contents of a SQLite in SQL and query it out and see the contents of that. If you want to reset that, or basically I think the only thing I can find that's sort of like officially sanctioned by Apple for interacting with revocation is other than when you receive the certificate and it's not signed, you have the option to either trust it or not trust it at the very beginning, but is to use the reset network settings, which will blow away the cache. That's kind of awkward though, because then it gets rid of a bunch of other settings at the same time. So there's not a whole lot of granularity for this on iOS. But again, the goal is to make these slides a general resource for people investigating a revocation. So maybe some helpful things if you want to look further and some pointers as to where to look. So in some ways, OCSP is a privacy disaster. And I think this is, if there's one takeaway from this talk, I would like it to be this, which is that as you're surfing and you hit a site where you haven't visited before, let's say you go through an online commerce store and you visit some products and then you go to the checkout site, which is HTTPS, that will initiate the OCSP request when that's not cached. And so you effectively leave a trail of requests out to the OCSP infrastructure of where you've been. And it's not very commonly talked about that your browser history for HTTPS sites is being leaked or given to the OCSP server operators. It's called a responder. But so you have to have a very high level of trust with your CA, the people who are running that server, because effectively you're giving them that snapshot of your browser history that includes every site that you visited that has an HTTPS connection on it. It would be good if someone kind of queried the big CAs to make even more clear whether they're using that data for any purposes. It would be very valuable for data mining. And it's not that there's a right or wrong answer to whether that should be done, so much as the policy should be very, very clear to the general public what the use of that data ever could be. I've got a slide a little bit later that'll show the different levels of logging on an OCSP server, and they can pretty much get, they're going to get your time and date stamp, they're going to get your IP address, and they're going to get the domain that you're requesting.
Some user agent browser data will go across because it's a lot of times it's going to be an HTTP type connection, so you're going to have some information about the browser which might identify or de-anonymize who you are, especially in conjunction with the time and the IP address.
You're talking about trusting the CAs. I think that's a very delicate topic because we are already trusting the CAs. How many CAs did you say we have on Apple? 190?
Yeah.
All of those can decrypt our traffic, right?
That's correct.
So we are already trusting them, more or less.
That's true.
What about domain? What about non-domain? What about Google Analytics? Is that getting that? The OCSP query, in other words, it's obviously making an HTTPS connection, right? All of the normal HTTPS headers apply. Right? What about the non-domain cookies?
So let me repeat the question. The question is, what about the non-domain cookies? So to be clear, this isn't your web traffic that's being exposed. It's only a check for verification of a certificate that belongs to the domain of the secure one. So you're not getting inside traffic. All your
The other thing is
leaking is the domain name.
Yeah, because it's cached, it's also not as powerful as a cookie where you're going to see like every URL they dig into or anything like that. You're just seeing the initial connection the first time that browser goes to a site that has HTTPS. So it's not as much information as Google cookies or Google AdWords. Yeah.
Does it only check the certificate, or does it also check the page that you're on?
So you only get a check for that domain. So it's not traversing below that. That's correct. It's on a per domain basis. But let's say, if an example path might be like you go to Amazon and then you check out, and so you visit a couple web pages for products. None of that would be leaked. What you leak is when it's not cached, the fact that you hit the HTTPS, store.amazon.com or whatever site, and the time and date when that happened. But again, it's pretty likely if someone wanted to go after that data, they'd be able to get a lot of specifics around what kind of device you have.
There's a bigger issue is if you have a large-scale aggregation of data, let's say you're in a repressive country or something, and a whistleblower goes to a site and uploads some information and stuff, it might identify that whistleblower. So it's situations like that where it can become a much more dangerous scenario rather than the day-to-day user might have.
Yep.
So.
What happens if the OCSP query fails?
So what happens if the OCSP query fails?
Or OCSP comes back and says, I don't know anything about this.
Yes. So not the response where it doesn't know anything about it is actually then a pass because it's saying it's not revoked.
So when CAA, so consider CAA issued a certificate, CAB issued a forward certificate for the same domain because he's compromised.
So with
CAB will go to the certificate for the CAB will still have the OCSP domain of the CAA, or it will have the cache go to CAA. The CAA will say, I don't know the certificate from CAB.
So before I jump into answering the question about man in the middle with multiple CAs, I want to point out that there are different levels of failure mode here. Sometimes the fail is hard, sometimes it's soft. So what does that mean? Do you continue on with that session, enabling that encryption to occur, or do you hard cut it off? And that's really up to the browser and the policies in your OS. And the different operating systems handle that differently. It'd be cool if we had a nice table showing, how they all handle them, but they're a little bit different. So hard fail and soft fail is a difference. And if you don't mind, we'll keep going on the presentation and get back to the man in the middle thing a little bit later. So you noticed when we did the OCSP request, it had that the date range at the bottom. They are time sensitive, and basically, again, the cache is held by the device, and it can only be good for that. But you could have a certificate that gets compromised out, under that time window. So it's good to think of this always in terms of a timeline. So again, your EV certificate's good for 2 years, but if you're looking at how this revocation infrastructure works, it has to be able to provide effectively an ongoing 24/7 availability of, is this certificate known to be compromised or not. So it helps to think of it in terms of the failure modes of the system as always having a time element to it. Okay, next slide. So revocation is not just for SSL. SSH certificates are, quick show of hands, who's a SSH user? Familiar with authenticated keys? Okay, awesome. You're in the right place if you're a crypto village, okay? OpenSSH 6.8 has a feature called key revocation lists. What this lets you do is have a set of keys, SSH keys, that are revoked. So the normal model for SSH authentication is you have a key pair that you exchange that you are allowing in. You can graft on PKI to that authentication, and this is a mechanism for taking certificates that are bad. So if you had a red team come and own a couple boxes on your enterprise network, and they left some keys around, it'd probably be good to drop these in a revoked keys list so that they couldn't be used anywhere else. And in general, I think having the mindset of managing SSH keys by a revoked keys list puts you in a much better position to respond to attacks and challenges with compromised keys. So again, just some directives here in your SSHD config to turn it on. It's called a KRL, which is a key revocation list. And you basically provide that as a file, which basically it stores all the bad keys as hashes. And then every time you're authorized in, it'll check that against it. So just good to know. I don't see this in heavy usage out there, probably because the PKI authentication integration for SSH is not all that common, but hopefully it'll be more common in the future. So you want to take that?
Oh, okay. And this is like we were just kind of pointing out that if you've got traffic that you can capture either on your network or from your browser and your host and stuff, Wireshark has a built-in OCSP decoder, and so you can actually run Wireshark or T-Shark, capture that data, and start looking at what's going on your network. This is useful for a number of reasons. You'll also see things like might be software or operating system updates on your network. You might catch a lot of different things when the OCSP queries are being made via HTTP rather than the HTTPS connections. So you get a little bit more information if you're a network admin of stuff that might be going through your network. But that's already built into Wireshark, and we just kind of wanted to point that out real quick.
Yep, there's been built-in support for OCSP since Wireshark 1.0, which is kind of cool. It's a protocol that's been around a long time. All right. If you want to run your own OCSP responder, you can do that with OpenSSL. And pick a port. I believe there's not a standard port for that. 2560 comes to mind. I don't know. But in this example, 7654. So you basically give this OpenSSL command and use an indexed file that when you set up the CA, it basically keeps a list of certificates that are under management in that file, and then you mark them as revoked. So there's a little bit of a question about how well just OpenSSL by itself scales for traffic. So typically, the big CAs, in fact, every CA that I know of isn't using OpenSSL. They're actually using another thing called EJBCA. So EJBCA is Enterprise Java Bean Certificate Authority. It's like a suite for managing a CA out of Prime Key. And they were typically at RSA and Black Hat. Anybody from Prime Key in the house? Okay. They're a really great solution. It's Java and Oracle backed, so it'll scale like crazy. It typically has a lot of load balancing, NetScaler type infrastructure in front of it when you want to really do the things at the size of Symantec or Digicert or the big CAs. It's got 3 logging modes, so you can log. So what I'm describing here is the logging behind the scenes that as you're hitting these OCSP servers, it can go on. There's just log4j for doing kind of daemon level logging for just troubleshooting the daemon and that it's got network connectivity and whatnot. Then there's transaction level logging, which can be customized. And then finally, what they call audit logs. So if you turn on audit logs, if those audit logs are turned on, that's where you just get a complete stream, of everyone's requests for this stuff. And that's kind of the privacy scare story right there. So again, these are features that are built in already. And if that data gets streamed off and caught and captured for data analytics purposes, again, it's neither good nor bad. It's just I think that the public could use some insights into if the CAs are doing that and what they're doing with that data. So also to say that it's a really, really dominant solution. Every OCSP responder I can find is backed by PrimeKey's EJBC. It's really, really dominant in the marketplace. And when you see that kind of monoculture, like if there was a flaw in that and someone could take down those servers, it could get pretty crazy. It's a little bit of a risk aggregation for global PKI usage. So short-lived certificates in terms of alternatives to OCSP and CRLs, like maybe this could be kind of like where we're going with the future. Short-lived certificates are one of those options. It kind of came into vogue around 2012. There's a Dan Bonet paper about short-lived certificates in which they very clearly declare that OCSP is as good as dead. And I guarantee you it's probably the #1 revocation check going on right now. Doesn't look like it'll change anytime soon, but it's good to have alternatives. The recommended timelines are like weeks or days, things of that timeline. And basically it would mean that the CAs would be just issuing, very, very short-lived certificates. So it's going to be pretty heavy lifting. If you think about, let's say your Apache servers would be replacing their certificate every week. I mean, it could be kind of challenging to get that set up, and it will also make the usage of PKI a little bit more dependent upon the CA. So they're kind of in favor, I think, in some ways, but it's a pretty complex topic. There's a lot of challenging effort that would have to go in to make this actually work. But that's one option. Again, with OCSP, you get this validity timeline, but the certificates are all the same. You only replace it when it fails. This would just be a continually replaced certificate, like on a weekly basis. The Acme project at Mozilla Firefox would fit very well with that vision, to be able to very quickly validate that a certificate is good from the CA for a specific domain. That's actually still under discussion. The industry at large, the CAs, the browser and OS companies are all debating that right now.
There's also like the IoT devices, because they have such small amounts of CPU powers, they're kind of limited on implementing.
Yeah, there's a variety of issues with the IoT. So there are IoT providers that have ways to manage certificates or having unique certificates on, or client certificates on each one of their devices. But there are hardware manufacturers that might just do stuff in bulk that can create huge problems with these kind of things. So yeah, there's a huge issue with that. There's also a huge issue for apps, not necessarily because of the app stores. The app stores are frequently doing the right thing, but if somebody writes bad code on the back end on how it's checking in, there's multiple layers where that can occur in software. So there are other issues there too, for sure.
So another alternative for revocation infrastructure is called certificate transparency. And it's not really a CT talk for those familiar with it, but I'll just give a quick highlight. CT is a Google-driven effort, and it basically applies a blockchain to this problem. And it's being already implemented in Google's operating systems and browsers, so it's kind of in place and going. As far as I understand, anyone from Google here, Chrome is not making OCSP requests as a habit. It's using CT instead of that. A good place to kind of see some of the CT logs, the census.io from Michigan has a nice sort of description of like statuses on all these CT logs that are in operation. So think of these as blockchain servers that are able to provide statuses on certificates. And then, with the future of certificate transparency, there's a debate ongoing about how redaction is handled, which would basically be the ability to make exceptions for presence in the blockchain. So kind of a current topic that would, open up lots of challenges to the future of CT. So I'll just leave it at that. And the certificatetransparency.org site, which Google operates, is a great source of information.
So when you say it applies to blockchain, does it mean that every certificate issued a particular CA is subsequently tied to the next one in the block, so you know all the certificates that are issued, or is that for a specific domain? I never could quite understand that.
Right. So would CT, that would be a policy. So the question is, would CT handle every certificate that gets issued? That would be a policy level a question. So the certificate authorities would answer that question for you, and they would either say, yes, we're going to operate this route with that assumption that every certificate comes out of here would be in the blockchain, or they may not do that. And right now we're in a situation where the most of the routes out there don't have CT support by default. So there will be a transition period where, if that is the goal, that we'll have to take some halfway steps to get to that point. So how is CT better than OCSP? Yeah. So it doesn't require an outbound request. The revocation typically gets bundled and then sent out on a periodic basis. Again, the timeline question applies. It's better in the sense that there's there's a number of reasons. It's subjects the issuances to an automatic process that would provide you some level of assurance that it has been issued, and the details of that issuance, which right now there are human factors that could get in the way, or things that are not logged. So it just provides automation, among other things. But again, this is not really a CT talk. There'll probably be a future talk here at DEF CON on CT, I'm sure. So in summary, you have to take your need to revoke trust about as important as your ability to establish trust. So it's revoking a certificate creates kind of a failure of PKI, right? This is where the website doesn't work. You can't reach the site, you can't get authenticated, stuff does not work. But if you don't have a fluid mechanism for handling revocation, you're not in a good position, right? You should be able to revoke as easily as you can grant on some level. And then we kind of walk through examples for CRL and then another example for OCSP. And for those who joined late, this slide deck provides a nice kind of worked example that you can use to kind of run this on your own operating system. And then online real-time revocation checks are kind of a privacy disaster and require you to place a level of trust in your certificate authority that exists there, of course, because they're your CA. But in addition, as you use, you don't think of so list all of the certificate authorities out there as you browse. You don't sit there and say, oh, I just went to order a pair of shoes online. Now I just told that to DigiCert, or I'm going to go. What's another good example? Or hit a messaging server, and now Semantic knows that I did that, right? But those are the things that are actually happening with these outbound requests for the use of revocation. What's that? Yes. Or whatever your vice of choice is. So,
Something else that we noticed that kind of comes up. It's not necessarily an OCSP or CRL thing, but there's an issue where people are not checking the certificates in line when they're surfing. And so if you're in a repressed country or repressed corporation and maybe they've got blue coat or something like that, we talked about the blue coat one that might be revoked, but checking the chain of certificates is going to tell you if there are people that are decoding traffic. If you've got a certificate added to your box where people can sit there, be it the corporation you work for, whatever, or government or whatnot, it's going to show you who else can decode some of your traffic. So it's a really important check, and it's something that most people don't think about. So it's something worth looking into. Again, it's not directly related. We ran across a lot of different certificate issues with like IoT and stuff like that. They're not revocation issues per se, but they're definitely interesting things to, a little bit different than that. Yeah. It's,
So how you check the OCSP response signature? So that will be in the log for the example, but that's handled by LibreSSL, OpenSSL. Your stack will make that check and fail out with that signature is not correct. How do you revoke? So revocation would be the presence of that in your OCSP server, right? So when that responder has that in its database, then that would be providing that as a revoked certificate. So again, if you look at the protocol, you can see it's HTTP plain text. You can read it and see that's taken place. Does that answer your question?
No, I meant if the OCSP server is how do you check it's still valid?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
you're saying you're trying to verify that the OCSP server's certificate is valid. You could actually make the request that we showed earlier to check against the certificate server, and the way that OCSP communication is authenticating is whether you're going to know whether it's the same one. You'd have to manually do that. I mean, there's nothing in the software that checks that on a regular basis.
Yeah, if the CA is compromised, you could. Okay.
It only applies to the one who issued the cert.
Okay.
It
Next slide.
Okay.
The OCSP server PS, and it's the CRL that's signed because that's an actual file, whereas OCSP is protocol.
That's correct. But the requests are signed. Okay, so shouts out to the DEF CON goons, DC 206, DC 408, DC 404. The CA Browser Forum has a revocation working group that are working on some of these topics, and they're hard at work at trying to kind of improve the situation. So shouts out to those guys. The Apple ProdSec team, hey. Team Obsters, and hi, Mom. I think we're good. So other questions? And we are out of time, yes. Yeah, so the question of OCSP stapling. There's specifically a flag with OCSP must staple, which is not in common use, which basically allows the server that you're talking to make that request out to the OCSP server and give it back to you signed, rather than the browser or operating system making that server directly. So that's exactly right. I should have had a slide there for that. So OCSP must staple is a promising way forward that does resolve some of those privacy concerns.
Yeah, the only thing is we don't see that many people using it. It's just when they're setting up their certs, they get this working, they're happy it's working, they leave. Yeah.
What about the OCSP must stable message support in browsers? Is this something that today's reading deployed?
So the question is, which browsers are supporting OCSP must staple?
I don't know.
Off the top of my head. There are common browsers that do support it. Chrome, I'm pretty sure Safari does.
So the URC for Google, they should be publicly viewing. Effectively, I think cancels the status of the CA, right? If you will see a SPO altogether. And I'm just kind of wondering, you guys talked about that? Right, where the essentially the browser remembers publicly the server no longer cares about the.
And I think that refers to the gentleman behind you's point about CA pinning. And I think, yeah, you're correct that does prevent a lot of this stuff. The issue that we end up running into is that, like, if you're in a repressed country or something like that, you may not have ever connected to the site in the whistleblower case to be able to have the pinning set up to be able to really help. So it's kind of a.
That's very clear, but if I want to operate a secure service, where I care about my customers, over the present countries and so forth,
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that more controls are better because you don't necessarily know how the browser or software, it's not necessarily a browser, is going to implement the checks. And so the more checks, the better is going to be the case in that. So, yeah. So.
Okay, thank you.